Shelly. Hey. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, me and Summer. We're gonna take turns.
Okay.
Do we need microphones though? Do we need microphones?
Yeah, that's. Yeah, I'll ask them which ones they want. And do you guys just prefer wireless?
We could. Yeah, the small.
Yeah, there's one. She has a presentation on a thumb drive, but that's not going to work on the tablet. She can email it, but where does she email it to? Me? You? Me? And then you? Okay, they're the last. I need a little help.
So they're gonna record what's on the screen. That'll be in the video. But so who is has the jump in?
The Disability Law Center, the girls over here.
Yeah. So if they email it to Ron or you, either way,
Okay.
and then you can put on here.
Okay.
Are you okay with this? Sorry, the view.
It looks far away.
So closer. I don't have the second camera because, or can't use the second camera because this is limited only to one camera. So if you can kind of tell me what's the most important thing that has to be in the shot?
The presenters probably and the cart, I would think.
So those two are the most important things, like the cart, or
The cart and the presenters.
so not as much the PowerPoint.
I don't think so. I'm not sure.
Okay.
So wait. Where is the cart? Is over there?
Yeah.
I had it confused then.
Oh.
Okay. So they can. Okay. I got it. Yay!
Okay. Whatever.
I can't see you. This way. I can't see you. This way. This way.
Okay, testing. Is this working? Yes. And like last Saturday, thank goodness. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open up the presentation. I'm Shelley Wyatt, Hard of Hearing Specialist. So we're recording this tonight. We're recording this tonight and for future use and for people to look back on. Maybe even live streaming it. I'll have to figure that out in a minute. So we are excited to bring you this presentation tonight. I'm really happy with our speakers tonight. It seems like many of us are unsure about requesting CART, and which is live captioning. And I'm hoping this gives us the confidence to start requesting it if you're afraid of it. The more of us who request CART, the better. The room is equipped with a telefoil, so if you have hearing aids with a T-coil or if they're in front of the T-coil, you can turn those on right now. And if you need if you need a device, then I have that for you too. And if you do, let me know. So tonight we have Intellicheck doing our CART for us because our regular CART provider is right here and she's presenting tonight. We also have Paul and, I'm sorry, Summer and Summer doing interpreting for us tonight. Thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic over to Julia Staff right now. And if you've been here before, you know she does our part for us consistently. She is presenting tonight to tell us more about what she does and the differences in services and her experience. So Julia has been, she provides CART services, and Julia Staff CART Services, LLC. And it has been established for 17 years. Julia provides CART coverage for classroom settings, meetings, live events, both on-site and remote. She has worked with the U of U, Westminster, Salt Lake Community College, for us, the Utah Vocational Rehab, the University of California in Santa Cruz. It would be better to be there in person, and various other businesses and community colleges, both here locally in Utah and remotely in Northern California. She also contracts with InnoCaptions, which is a caption app for cell phones that uses live captioning. So here we go, Julia.
Hi everyone. I think I know almost everybody. So, typewriter, and that's not always the case. And so in my research, I found Captions First. Great resource. So let's say you've gone to your supervisor and said, in the staff meeting, I'm missing such and such and such. I really need captions because of my hearing loss. What do we need to do? And they're going to help advise you on what needs to happen next. And it's probably going to be a conversation possible on what will work for you and where to send them to look for information. Google's great nowadays. Most of the time you just throw in, I need to know about captions, and you have a bunch of links. I have a couple extra links that I will send home with you tonight that you can use. This is one of them. These guys have a full information on card captioning, the difference in each of them. And it took me away from my, sorry, it was on a different page just a minute ago. CART stands for Communication Access Real-Time Translation. CART Services is a certified CART provider who listens to speech and instantaneously translate verbatim from our stenograph machine to a computer. Can you tell I sit behind the computer and not in front, talking on my desk thing? Can be done in all sorts of different situations. You can have one-on-one, as you see the gentleman up there with the computer screen. As you see here with IntelliText, you have it for a group setting. You can have a platform where you have a PowerPoint and run captions along the bottom of the PowerPoint for people to see. There's remote CART, which is basically I sit at home. So like for UC Santa Cruz, I call into the classroom so that I can hear the professor and students. And then it translates through the internet and goes to the student's computer that they're watching. And it could be 10 students, it could be one. Most cases, the university has to have the student in the classroom in order to supply the captions, with the exception of a couple in California, which the student doesn't have to be there, but we have to caption no matter what. So we don't ever know if the student's even there. It can caption to your cell phone. There's a couple of different places, streamtext.net, OneCap app, onefusion.com, that allows you to either do to a computer, to your cell phone. But basically, it's us again listening on a dedicated line. It goes through the internet, streams to your phone. So sometimes when you see a lag, like when you're watching captionings, that's somebody listening, typing, goes into their computer, goes into the feed for the TV, and the TV then sets it out, and that's another whole person that runs that. So, because I get that question a lot, that's why I'm not telling you. And that's why it might lag when you're sitting there watching it live. And of course the projector I talked about. My scenarios are, I am usually contacted either by the Disability Resource Center at a university, or Human Resources, or an operations manager who's had a request for CART by an employee or a student. The Disability Resource Center always knows who I am, so I don't have to explain a lot there, but usually businesses don't understand what CART is. They don't understand the different types of CART, which include TypeWell, which is what IntelliText is. And I think sometimes the client doesn't know what to quite ask for. So some of my suggestions is know what those are. So CART, we aim for real-time translation verbatim. Every every comma, we aim to transcribe at 95% or more accuracy. Truth is, depending on my client, that may not be the case. If they don't want every break in sentence, whatever, and they let me know, I will help them to get some of that stuff out. IntelliText works with Typewell, which is a meaning for meaning. So they capture the meaning of what's happening. It does cut down the transcript. Cuts out like my ums. But they same thing. The goal is to capture the correct meaning and deliver the message completely. And the reason I bring it up is you as a consumer need to know which one you need. If you can't get a cart provider, or you're a small company whose finances may be limited, you need to know if Typewell type situations would work for you. Is it going to keep you in the loop of what it is you need to know to do your job or your class successfully? If you go to Captions First, like I said, this kind of runs down so people can get a visual. On YouTube, if you Google what is CART / captions, there's a 15-minute video that shows kind of how it works, how they follow students, how they work with companies inside a corporate setting. Remote CART, I've had experiences where, and this was actually with a student, they didn't want anybody to know they were using a captioning program. So I walked into the classroom and said, my name's Julia Stepp, I'm here on the Disability Resource Center's request, and they're like, well, for who? I don't know. I'm going to sit back here in the corner, I'm going to stream to whoever is using it, don't know who that is, and if they have more questions, I just send them back to the Resource Center to clarify that they usually send an email before I get shown up, so professors are aware. You could do that in a, I don't know how you couldn't do that in a meeting, a work meeting. You could say, I need somebody that I don't want anybody to know. That is your personal right. And it could be an easy, somebody's calling into the meeting and maybe people are mad because they think you're playing on their phone, but you know you're reading the captions. Questions? I'm not sure what else everybody wants to know. Mine's pretty easy.
Is there
I'm kind of curious about, in a meeting, is there a transcript, and then can you send that transcript, and do people get in trouble with transcripts?
That's actually a good question. So, at the school, the Disability Resource Center owns the transcript. I'm allowed to share it with the student that I'm transcribing for. They're not allowed to share it with anybody else. I did have one time where a professor asked if he could see what it looks like, and it was before charity. So I went to Carol and I said, you know, this is what the professor wants, and we made it very clear that he can share it or redo it or whatever, but it was his own lecture he wanted to look at. So with approval, in a meeting setting, that would be between you and your employer. I don't know why the employer would stop you from having a copy if you needed it to make sure you have the correct notes to take care of something, but I've never had anybody say no to that situation. I did have a division of Child and Family Services where the lawyers did not allow the transcript to go out. And that was between the lawyers and DCFS. So DCFS owned the transcript, they had to decide what they were doing. So the person who owns it gets the transcript. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Like here, anything I do for CART, I have to submit to whoever hired me here.
I'm just curious with CART, if that's a good resource for everyone, or if people really aren't aware of CART. And so how can we promote that awareness about CART? What do you suggest?
Request, request, request. Don't let them deny you. Know what's available in your area, maybe. Shelley has a list she'll hand out of local CART providers, as well as IntelliText, and as well as remote CART providers that we have that have supplied information for Utah residents. I personally, if somebody calls me, I give them my information, and I also give them 3 or 4 other people that provide CART in the community. Even if I can cover it, if they want to research it, I'd like them to do that. I'm very open about, here's the list of resources. Many times I've sent them to the website. We kind of changed the website, so I just keep an email now that I can distribute to people. If you don't request, we're going to go away, I'm going to be honest. There is speech to text. It's getting there, but it's not there. But as long as people aren't complaining, they're going to continue to do speech to text and kind of replace this. And then be mediocre instead of what you really need.
Do you feel that universities and here and different educational settings, whatever you provide CART, I lost my thought, hold on a second. Do you feel they're really well aware and they can advocate for access? Or do you often have to provide information out to people in the community?
University-wise, is that your first question? I think our local universities, and Charity might be able to help you there because she went to some of our local universities, so she can help you with her experience there. Here locally, other than the University of Utah and Salt Lake Community College, they use a lot of Typewell. They hire students or they hire people and they're on staff. From what I can understand, at like, I want to say Utah State University and Weber. I don't know what Logan does. They do have my rates on file, but I never actually had a request for, what is that, Utah? I don't know what one's in Logan. Business-wise, when I get a request, it's somebody who knows what CART is and has had it and is demanding it, but they don't know how to explain it to and it's usually human resource. They don't understand what it means. And so I do, again, I talk through how that works and the reason a person might need it. Recently, Human Resources at State of Utah called me in because they have a social worker who kind of is a hybrid. She signs, she uses captions, her first language is English. But in the field, you can't just like, hey, I'm going to call my CART person and they're going to help you while I'm at a family meeting that I didn't know I had until 5 minutes ago. Me personally, I'm booked out 2 weeks in advance, so you got to find somebody last minute, and that can be difficult. So we sat down together, and I actually listed out every alternative they have. Interpreter, when she needs it, she'll know what that needs to be. CART for training, any staff meeting. They hooked her up with InnoCaptions for phone calls. And there's an app called Ava that she downloaded, so if she's in an emergency situation at a family home, she has a way to capture what's going on. So, but the Utah State Human Resources didn't have a clue what CART was, even though they have one of us on staff. hired me here.
Utah State.
Oh, nobody's hired me for Utah State yet.
No, you just said that even though you were on staff, is that for Utah?
No, that's for here, Utah, for the state of Utah.
Oh.
I'm on staff. And the Sanderson Center hired me. Any other questions?
Say for a student who's going to college, does it cost money to get a cart?
You want to repeat it?
Okay, yeah. So she's asking for the student. Okay. For a student who's going to college who needs a cart, then do they pay extra for it? I say no, I think it's all the same, but I'll let Charity or one of the legal aid answer that question. I would assume they would charge more. I don't think they can. So it should be a request. You meet with your disability advisor and they can help you with that. Any more questions?
Thank you. So our next presenter is Charity Harding, and I'm eager to hear what she has to tell us about requesting cart services herself and how she helps people at the U of U get the needed accommodations. Charity is a deaf services coordinator, disability advisor at the University of Utah. Beginning of January 2018, she holds a BA in cultural anthropology from Brigham Young University. As per requirements of her degree program, she did field research teaching science at a secondary school for the deaf in Ghana, West Africa during the summers of 2009 and through 2011. And she has worked in education for the deaf in Utah at the Jean School from 2012 to 2018. So Charity is deaf and used cart services for the majority of her own university education as well as ASL interpretation, and now coordinates both these services for the deaf and hard of hearing students attending the University of Utah.
Just trying to figure out where I'm supposed to stand. So my name is Charity, and my nickname was Bear. My brother, he gave me this nickname and a name sign to follow it as a bear. So to give you a little bit of history about my experiences, I grew up hearing, became deaf, so hearing I could hear, became deaf at 18. And so, kind of interesting, I could see both sides of the fence, so to say. I could see the deaf culture's perspective, and I could see the North culture and their perspective as well. In high school, I started to lose my hearing. I could wear hearing aids, and I was fine. I was good enough. I felt I got good grades, and I understood everything. I just sat in the front row and didn't really have any problems. But then when I got to college, it started to get a little awkward. It became more of a challenge. My older brother, he became an interpreter, an actual ASL interpreter. So when I was in college, he was kind of reviewing the situation and said, you know what, you need these things. You've got to take care of this and this and this and this. And I thought, oh wow, I had no idea. I didn't have the exposure, the experience. I had no idea how to really advocate for myself and to get the accommodations that I needed. But I also didn't know what was available. But my brother, because of the experiences, did know these different things that were available. So you need to take a class with interpreters. You don't have delayed education, so you want to be able to start your classes right now. You want to keep going. So one thing that could really help you would be using CART, because you don't really know sign language. I thought, oh, okay, CART, so what is that? You're like, well, essentially it's like a court reporter, you know. You've seen TV honest with you. And she's a really nice lady. She's a friend of mine. Her name is Jeanette. I was like, oh, okay, sure, why not? So my first day I get to class, and it was cool. She was a really nice person. She explained everything. She made me feel really comfortable in the situation. Just like Julie was mentioning, being open and willing to share and kind of work together as a partner almost to make sure that we felt really comfortable with the services. So I had a really good person that helped me. It was a good experience for me. It never was something that I felt really awkward about or frustrated with. It was a good transition experience for me. So that was really amazing because I noticed the big difference. One thing was that I could understand everything, right? It was like, oh yeah, I was totally involved in the discussion. When the teacher turned around and was speaking at the board before high school, that was always a difficult problem for me. But now I was catching everything. So in the past, in high school, I had to kind of try and figure out what the teacher might be saying. But now I was catching everything. I was like, oh, this is so great. I'm even catching the student comments that are behind me and everything. It was fabulous. My grades were good. I graduated high school with a 4.0, but college, my grades kind of dipped. So I had full access now to understand everything. So I was able to excel in college as well. Then I was learning sign language. So so as an example, I just want to share, I can speak for myself, but there's always kind of a language conflict. Should I speak? Should I sign? I don't know. It depends, I guess. But so going back to college, I started at Slick, and they provided CART. See, this was before Typewell. I'm old school. We didn't have this current technology, so we didn't have the Typewell program yet. But it was a really good service. So I studied cultural anthropology, and the interpreter got it. Just want to make sure that they got it. Okay. I really like studying everything about cultures. I found it very fascinating, these different countries and the way their cultures were and whatnot. But to go to a different country and study, you feel kind of like there's a barrier because you really want to be able to interact with people in these different countries. And so as a deaf person, that made it even harder, right? So if I could hear, it would make it easier to try and work with people of different culture. But as a deaf individual, trying to use sign language, I couldn't bring CART with me. So I think that, like your question that you had asked beforehand, you had said, how do we expose people to this service? Like, how do we make sure people know that it's available? So again, going to a different country, it felt like that kind of thing. I didn't have CART there, but for me, I felt like the best thing was I had to expose these people to this situation. I had to tell them about it. Just like Julia mentioning that some students prefer to keep kind of, private their services that they're receiving for their disability. And maybe they're just looking at their phone and you don't recognize that they're actually getting something that's captioned. And that's fine. It's different for everyone. We should respect that. But to have that access and that knowledge to be able to be shared equally, it's not something we should be embarrassed about. Deaf people can use the service, and we can show that it's positive by smiling about it, right, when we're asking it and showing it. But it's educating other people in a positive way. If we're positive about it and we explain things in positive ways, I think they understand that it's better as well. Like they can see the positivity of it and the benefit. So, do you have any questions for me yet, or do you want me to share more of my boring history? I can hear it for you.
I'll voice you. I remember when I went to the U of U, let me stop. When I went to the U of U, and this is before I even came to the Sanderson Center and learned about about CART, about, dealing with hearing loss, that kind of thing. And so I did use an assistive listening device, and like you said, it was a real challenge. I made sure I sat in front, and I had a hard time taking notes because I have to depend so much on lip reading.
So how did you, so I would have a student next to me take notes for me, but I would make sure that they were good note takers. So how do you handle that if you use a cart, or do you use, or would a student use a note taker? What do they do now? This was back in the 90s.
Sorry, so in my experience, in the classroom where I was receiving the cart services, I would have the person doing the cart using a laptop, and then another student would take notes, next to me. So you're right, you can't read or watch the interpreter while you're trying to write notes at the same time. You don't have the ability to have one eye on one thing and one eye on the other, so it just doesn't work that way, right? So, I had both services, and so it's important to get the services that you need, and again, it depends on everyone, but you should never feel like you have to have both either necessarily. It's really up to you, the student. And I'm not the person who decides what someone needs, but I make recommendations, or I mention what is available, and I can explain those things. I can say, well, we have these different options for you. We have this option, that option. So we can talk about what fits your needs. Because I'm not in the classroom, so I may not know what their needs are. I think, again, the students are their own best advocate in these situations, because maybe, you first go into the class, you don't really know what to expect, you don't know what you need, and that's fine, that's okay. So, well, let's try these options, let's try something, or let's try all of the options and see. An interpreter, the typo or cart, and the note taker, all of it, whatever. And then after seeing it, you can then say, I'm good with just this or that. And then we can, discontinue the other service. We can change things to make it better for you, or we can adapt to fit your needs. And that's fine. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions?
Yes. Doesn't the...
Oh, that's right. Not used to being the
Thank you. Doesn't the use of cart in its modern form eliminate the need for a note taker? I guess I'm asking, couldn't there just be an automatic transcript given of every class so that a person wouldn't need a note taker?
That's interesting. I never really thought, I didn't really experience that kind of a situation, I think, either, where now, while I was in college, I was there long enough, but I think the only thing was, I know that they offered both services together. So, especially if the student decides to have that, notes might be a little different than cart. But in offering the cart, transcript, right? The transcript. I think they didn't offer that to everyone. So as part of your comment, I'm not sure if you were wondering if that's what they gave you, or did you have both? So just clarifying. So I guess the idea was that if they have cart, they would just get the transcript from cart, not meetings, right?
Right.
So I see. So if somebody does disagree with that, though, I actually don't mind stepping in, because I think it's okay to have both. The student is the one that should be able to make that decision, not someone else. And so if they say that they want handwritten notes, I'll be like, oh yeah, no, it's their right to ask for that. I think it's important for them that they're informed. So they can, if somebody were to say, hey, you don't need note takers, like say there's some certain situation, somebody says you don't need a note taker, you have the transcript. I would be willing to fight for them in that situation to say, no, they have the right to both of those. I think that it's important for them to talk to the resource center or to know the ADA laws, that they can have those accommodations for both. They could even have the transcript and the handwritten notes, because they could be different, right? And again, it's just what do they need. So I think with that kind of thing, it is sort of common for people to think that. Some instructors will say, well, they'll send me an email, and they'll say, I don't think we need both these services. One service is enough, that's sufficient. And I'll say, okay, well, I'm glad that you're willing to accommodate the student appropriately, and let me explain to you a little bit of my understanding and how we can help to accommodate them appropriately. These are the things that we can do, and these are the reasons why. And it's also probably better and cheaper than you even think, but again, it's also requirement by law, and so that usually helps them understand, and then it's not a problem. But I think what's important is continuing the education and doing it in a positive way to help educate people. Some people just don't really know, and so that's okay.
Please don't have a question from Mike.
You got it.
So please don't have a question. Here with Clark, we have a transcript, which we can read later, right? And make notes off of that, because the issue that I have with ASL interpreters is that, of course, I can take notes, but then relying on someone else to take notes is from their thoughts, from so it doesn't. So if you can get the transcript from the card, I can make my own notes later.
But again, it's up to the individual still.
So the question is, do we get that transcript?
Yeah. Okay, so in my experience, yes. The transcript, the entire thing, is available to you. We email it to the student later, right? The entire thing. And honestly, that's one thing I love in college. I love being able to go to class, read along, or follow along, and then go home a few hours later. I would get an email of the full transcript of the whole lecture. And yeah, it was very nice. I did honestly feel kind of spoiled to have the services.
Let me add a little bit onto that. Just as an example, an hour-and-a-half class could be anywhere from 70 pages to 150, depending the subject matter.
True.
So I've experienced both, where I've had a student new to CART, and that's a lot of pages to read through when you've got 4 classes at an hour and a half each day. So she actually had a note taker and would take the notes and the transcript and get what they needed. In pharmacy, the student used interpreters if it was just a meeting and he didn't have to have notes. And the first semester was pretty rocky for both of us because I had never been in a pharmacy class in my life, let alone what verbiage I was going to get thrown at me from not Gen Chem, from people who've been doing research in metabolic chemistry for 30 years and on the list for a Nobel Prize. Anyways, by the end of the first semester, we had a really good working relationship, and we had a system. And every time the slides changed, I put in next slide, and then it would jump. And when the student would go through the handouts and the book, they could take the slides and match it up to where it was in the transcript and skip back to where they needed to be to match up what they didn't understand in the lecture. Just some different experiences with what I've seen.
And that is one thing. One of the reasons why when I was going to the university at BYU, I realized having the choice of CART, getting the entire and specific vocabulary in the transcript, because again, my major was in anthropology. So it wasn't just very general concepts. I mean, it had general concepts, sure, but it also had the requirement of very, very specific and detailed vocabulary. So if it was just based on interpreter, and the interpreter might have signed something, maybe my brain wouldn't be able to connect it to the exact term or word that was used, but it was the concept. I needed to know the vocabulary. So CART was a very big benefit for me in my program, so that it allowed me to always be equal to my peers in knowing all the vernacular that was needed in that program. Okay, I think I'm done. Hey, love you guys.
Okay, thank you, Charity. Thank you. So, okay, now we're also honored to have the Utah Disability Center here with us today, and we have two people here to help us navigate our rights through CARD today. And it'll take us a few minutes because she's going to set up a presentation first. We have Laura Henry, who is the Associate Legal Director at the Disability Law Center, and she has worked there since 2007 and supervises work on the center's community integration, employment, and education teams. Ms. Henry's practice has focused on litigating employment discrimination cases as well as policy efforts to support and expand community integration options for people with disabilities. Rose Lindsay, and I'm never going to be able to say your last name.
Guimarães. It's Portuguese. It's really hard to pronounce.
Thank you. She joined the Disability Law Center in 2018 as a staff attorney, and she is focused primarily on employment discrimination under the ADA, with an emphasis on litigation. Before joining the Disability Law Center, Ms. Lindsay advocated on behalf of hundreds of clients with disabilities in the criminal justice system as an assistant federal public defender in the Northern District of Illinois. So, okay, we'll bring them up now and give them a chance to set up the presentation.
This one? Does that work for everyone? We'll do this. If this works for everyone, then that'll be great. Well, my name is Laura Henry. Thank you for that kind introduction, Shelley. Thanks for having us here. We're excited to talk about, I'll say, requesting accommodations in various settings, because I would be lying to you if I said I was an expert on CARD. I am not. But I do a lot of work with people who have various types of disabilities requesting accommodations of all sorts. And what I can tell you is that the process for requesting an accommodation really isn't very different depending on what the accommodation you're requesting is. So hopefully this information will all be useful to you as people considering requesting CART in particular, but also, any other accommodation that might be useful to you. We've talked about interpreters and note takers and a few other things, and hopefully the process that we're going to talk about today, that would apply equally to those things and, anything else that would be necessary for someone in the workplace. So I'll just get started.
too much time talking about us. But anytime I do a presentation, I just feel like it's important to let people know that we're here and we're out there, and that our services are offered at no cost to our clients. So sometimes I think people get a little gun shy about interacting with lawyers, rightly so, frankly. But we want to just make sure that people know they can access our services without incurring cost. Oh, I will slow down a little bit for the card person. Okay, good. See, this is a good experience for us all. Okay. So this is the Disability Law Center's mission. Essentially, we want to create a just and fair society where everyone can participate, and it's a little more detailed up there, but you get the gist. Very briefly, and then I will be more specific to the topic that I was asked to come here and present on. These are the areas that the Disability Law Center works on, just in case you needed to access these services. We provide services related to education, preventing abuse and neglect, not encouraging it. Sometimes with that bullet point up there, I don't want there to be confusion about what we're advocating for. Public policy, access and rights, employment, housing, and assisting people who have representative payees under the social security system. So general questions for today are, what is the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act? What is a reasonable accommodation, and how do I get one? And just some tips and tricks to think about when you're requesting accommodations. So the ADA, and I should mention right up front here that the Americans with Disabilities Act is the law that kind of most commonly is talked about when we request accommodations. But at the outset, Julia was mentioning that there are other laws that allow someone to request an accommodation too. And so even though this presentation is focused largely or exclusively on the ADA, it's important to note that really the analysis would be the same under either the Rehabilitation Act or even the IDEA. When you're requesting an accommodation, kind of these are the factors that you're going to look for. So this discussion is even a little bit more broad than what is presented on the slides. So really quickly, who is covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act? So the legal definition is that you have to have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. You can also have a history or a record of such a disability. You can be regarded as a person with a disability. The trick here is it's meant to be broad. The law was amended in 2008 because some people were essentially getting kicked out saying, hey, if you have a hearing aid, for example, then you're mitigating the effects of your disability and you weren't covered under the ADA. And so it was creating all kinds of problems. So in 2008, Congress actually fixed that and said, no. We want coverage under the law to be broad. We want it to be available to everyone. So if you were ever to get pushback of someone saying your disability didn't qualify, that would be really silly and inaccurate. So who is covered under Title I of the ADA? And Title I is the part of the ADA that protects people with disabilities specifically in the context of employment. Now, we also talked a little bit earlier today about colleges and universities. The ADA also applies to colleges and universities, to private settings, doctor's offices, those kinds of things, but those are under different titles. So again, we're talking about Title I because that relates to employment, but the analysis is the same. It's going to be the same for a college or a university, or a doctor's or a dentist's office, that kind of thing. So in order to be qualified under the ADA, essentially what that means is that you have to be a person who has the requisite skill or knowledge to compete for the position that you're applying for, which I think, makes sense to most folks. If you're applying for a job, you think it's a job that you're able to do and are qualified to perform. You have to be able to perform the essential functions of the job, but here's the really important part to consider, is that you can perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodations. So if when you're looking at a job, you think, yeah, absolutely, I could do this if I had, CART, or I had interpreting services or note takers or whatever it is, then you're absolutely qualified to perform that position. It doesn't have to be without those accommodations. So always make sure to think of what is the possibility of accommodations that are out there, and if you had them, would you feel okay about the job? Because that's what the ADA says would make you qualified. And it's important, I think, that you know this because employers won't always know this. So even though I would love to live in a world where you could go into every interview and be assured that the folks that you were sitting down with knew all this information backwards and forwards, I think that is not the case, and it's important to equip yourself with all of the knowledge that you can. So under the ADA, the other thing I just like to point out always is that it's actually a very broad law. I think people know that that the ADA maybe protects them from being fired because of a disability or protects them when they're requesting an accommodation, but it protects people with disabilities in all facets of employment. So, benefits, recreational activities, layoffs, promotion, pay. Basically, any term or provision of your employment should be, equal, and it shouldn't be different based on a person's disability. So I just like to point that out in case that were to ever come up. Okay, so here, hopefully, now we've gotten to the main show why we're here today. Reasonable accommodations. So, that's a term that's thrown around a lot, but what does it mean? What is it? Well, basically, it's any change in the way something is normally done that would allow a person with a disability an equal employment opportunity. Or, if we're in the school context, an equal opportunity in school to be equal with your peers. So what the ADA is aiming for is equality in playing field. And I think that's really important to point out because I think sometimes the pushback that we get, or at least that I see in my line of work, is an employer or professor maybe saying, well, I don't want to give this accommodation because that would be unfair. It would be unfair to the other students. It would be a leg up. And that really misunderstands the ADA, right? Because the whole point is to create an equal playing field. And if you can't understand what a professor is saying because their back is turned or you don't have access to the same information as your colleagues in a meeting, then you're at a disadvantage, right? So the whole point of the ADA is to say, no, people deserve to have an equal playing field. So if you want an accommodation, what do? So the accommodation process is pretty simple, but it's important to kind of know all of the different steps. So the first thing that's important to know is there's no magic words. You don't have to say, I hereby request a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act and cite to some, code of federal regulations. You don't have to do that. You basically just have to make it clear that you're requesting a change in the way that something is normally done and that that's related to your medical condition or disability. The other thing that's important to know, though, is that the employee really needs to initiate that process, or the student or whomever. It really can't, under the law, come from the employer. And so sometimes a client will tell me, well, hey, my boss knew I was struggling in this particular area, and they knew I had a disability, and so they should have offered me something. And even if that might seem right, that's not the way the law kind of says it needs to take place. The law says, no, the individual with a disability really needs to initiate that process and say, hey, supervisor, employer, HR, professor, whomever, this is what I need. So it's really important to know that it starts with you, essentially. You're not required to disclose your exact disability when you request an accommodation. It doesn't have to be in writing. There's an asterisk there because I'm a lawyer, and so I only see situations when they go bad. So while it doesn't have to be in writing, what I can tell you is that I think it is smart and important for it to be in writing, and that protects you and the employer. And it doesn't have to be writing in the sense of a form. Lots of companies will have a form that they'll want you to fill out, but an accommodation could also be sent in an email, in a text. Then you have it memorialized, and also that way it's easier when a supervisor changes. That's one of the biggest things that I see when folks come into our office is that they've had an accommodation and it's actually been working really well. And then a new supervisor shows up, and that supervisor was not privy to whatever the previous understanding was, and it wasn't written down anywhere, and now there's going to be problems. So again, the law says it doesn't have to be written down, but please write it down. That's what I'm telling you. The process should be interactive. So what that means is that you should be able to go to your employer and have a conversation. You know, it shouldn't be that you send a request that goes into an email void and is never responded to for weeks or months on end. It should be, you know, questions from the employer back to you about what it is you need, about why it is you're asking for a certain thing, and vice versa. It's really just meant to be a process, a conversation where you and your employer can work out what's going to be beneficial for you and also beneficial for the employer. When you request an accommodation, an employer at that point can ask for medical documentation. And that's a question I think we get a fair bit as well as, you know, is that right? Is that okay? And the answer is legally, if you're requesting an accommodation from an employer, then yes, the employer can at that point say, please provide me with medical documentation that this accommodation is appropriate for the disability at hand. It doesn't need to be extensive or exhaustive documentation. You know, a doctor's note in most cases should suffice, but they can ask you to provide that. Okay. So accommodation basics. When I was thinking about CART and what might be helpful for you all to know in obtaining it, I thought it would be good to explain that what an accommodation is really meant to be at its core is an effective solution to a problem, right? So if the problem is that you're missing things in a meeting, then the accommodation needs to be effective in responding to that particular problem. So that's going to look different in different contexts, in different employment settings. But it's important, I think, for you all to know that it has to be effective. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like practically right now. So what is an effective accommodation? So when I was looking at this, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. They're called the EEOC. They have guidance. They enforce civil rights laws that pertain to employment. So they enforce the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this is a specific example that the EEOC gave about when CART in particular would be the most effective accommodation when someone asked. So you can read here, but essentially it says that Kendall works as an associate in this firm. Kendall has a hearing disability for which he uses a hearing aid and lip reading. His company sometimes conducts video conferencing meetings with clients in other countries. And Kendall has been finding it difficult to participate because the client speaks with foreign accents and the video feedback is not continuous. So Kendall requests use of CART. And then down at the bottom, essentially the EEOC says, the question is, would this be a reasonable accommodation? The EEOC says, yes, absolutely it would. And the reason is that it would allow Kendall to participate fully in the meetings and should be provided absent undue hardship. And we'll get there in a little bit. But I think that's the really important thing in making your case, essentially, for why CART is the right accommodation and not something else. I've learned a lot just in listening to the speakers who went before on why CART in particular is important and why it's better than some other options that are out there. But if you don't educate people as to what those reasons are, they're likely going to look for a solution that is not as effective. And again, effective is the key. And so that's a word or term you're going to want to use when you're talking about, you know, what accommodations you need. So when CART may not be the most effective accommodation. So similarly, the EEOC, in looking around, it provided this example that essentially said, in the first one, example 18 up there, an employee with bilateral hearing loss requests use of a CART for an upcoming training. And again, I'll kind of skim down, but it says that the employee would be able to use an ALD instead, and that actually would allow the employee to participate fully in the training. And that if that were the case, because the ALD is cheaper essentially than CART, that might be okay for the employer to say, no, we wouldn't offer CART in this particular scenario, we would offer the assistive listening device. But again, I think what's important here is they don't give a lot of facts about why that would be effective. They just kind of say, yes, that would work for the employee in this setting. And so again, I think that's what's really important in the accommodation request. If you don't think the ALD is going to be sufficient, and if it's really not going to work, and if it's not going to provide equal access, then it's important to explain to the employer or human resources why that is. Because an employer is allowed to look for an option that is effective, but cheaper. But again, it has to be effective. It can't just be that the employer would prefer to find an accommodation that costs less. So again, I think it's just important to kind of know how to frame your request and what kind of things to highlight, because I think typically you're going to be educating the employer on this issue as well. Maybe not, maybe they're very familiar, but my guess would be no. This other example is about interpreters, because that's a scenario that I've seen quite a bit too at the center, where an employee requests the use of an interpreter for a particular scenario, and the employer tries to say, no, write notes, do these different things. And in those scenarios, again, it's arguing why, no, the interpreter over note writing or whatever the alternative that is being offered, that's not adequate for the following reasons. That's not going to allow me to participate in real time, for example. That's not going to allow me to ask questions. I'm going to have to go back and review these notes when the meeting is done. And then what if I didn't understand something? It's making those arguments, and it's helping people understand why it provides access that's less than equal, that's less than what everybody else is getting, that's really important to highlight. So this is kind of like stepping back now from CART in particular to reasonable accommodations kind of broadly. What I always say when I'm presenting on reasonable accommodations is that I actually think it's really nice that the ADA doesn't have a kind of prescriptive list that says, here are 10 accommodations and that's all. Instead, the ADA says an accommodation could look essentially 1,000 different ways, because it has to match up with a particular disability and a particular employment setting. And so it could look many, many different ways. But we do know through cases that have gone through the court system that these type of accommodations are usually going to be reasonable, and I think it just helps to get people thinking. So making facilities accessible, part-time or modified schedules, acquiring or modifying equipment, and you can read the rest, but it's just a few examples of the types of things to consider. So if those are reasonable accommodations, I guess that begs the question, what are not reasonable accommodations? And so here are a few things that, again, courts have concluded, if you request these things, they're probably not going to be reasonable. They're not going to be granted. An employer, a university, a doctor's office, whatever, is not going to have to provide these things. So they're not going to have to eliminate essential job functions. If we had a lot more time, I would bore you on how you determine if something is essential or not. But basically, you can't ask to waive functions that are central to a position. So if I'm applying to be a pizza delivery person, I can't say that I'm not going to deliver the pizzas, right? That's central to what I'm being hired to do, and I can't say I'd like to have somebody else do that for me. Now, you laugh, but employers think a lot of things are essential, so I think that's the thing to keep in mind. Lowering production standards that are applied to all employees, that's something like if you're working in a factory setting and there's a requirement that you produce 10 TVs an hour or something, you can't say, I'd only like to produce 8, right? You can say, I need this accommodation so that I'm able to produce 10, but you can't say, I just like to produce 8, if that makes sense. Providing personal use items, so that would be something like a hearing aid, a wheelchair, a cane. The employer isn't responsible for providing that. Now, would they be responsible for providing, a phone or a device that worked with a hearing aid? Absolutely. But an employer isn't going to be on the hook typically for an item that you take home and use everywhere you go, not just at the employment setting. Changing an employee supervisor, I always say, I wish this were, right? Because we've all had supervisors that we would rather escape from. But unfortunately, that's not an accommodation under the ADA. You can ask for a transfer. The employee can to a different position, but you can't say, I like Jim and not Sarah. that kind of a thing. I'm going to just kind of skip down to the bottom here to go to undue hardship, because sometimes I think, and I think in the case of CART, or I've certainly seen this come up with interpreters, an employer, again, doctor's office, what have you, might say, well, I'd like to provide that, but I can't because it's too expensive. When they pull the too expensive card, essentially what they're arguing under the law is that providing that accommodation would amount to what's called an undue hardship. And so I just wanted to give you guys some information about what the law says an undue hardship is, because I think sometimes there's a difference between what a particular employer thinks and what the law really requires. So what is an undue hardship? Factors to include consist of the following, which I realize is a lot of text, but essentially what you're supposed to consider are the total resources of the company, and everything that is available to them. If you're looking at a company that is smaller or a subsidiary of a larger organization, you look at the resources of the larger organization, not the smaller one. So if you're talking about a satellite office somewhere, but there's bigger corporate offices somewhere else, you're not talking about the budget of the satellite office. You're talking about the bigger, broader budget. Same with a local branch of a bank or something like that. So in my experience, usually I would say, and I'm sorry, lawyers are always hedging our bets, right? So usually I would say that it's unlikely that an accommodation request of an interpreter is going to be an undue hardship for a big company. Now, could it be for a smaller company? The ADA applies to employers with 15 or more. If we're talking about a company with 16 or 17 employees, maybe. But again, we have to look at the resources totally available to the company, not how much they would like to spend on accommodations, right? Those are two very different things, and I think sometimes, employers either don't know or don't want to tell you all that that's the analysis that should be going on. So while it's true that the law says an employer doesn't have to provide an accommodation that would pose an undue hardship, it's actually a pretty high burden to meet legally. And so, if you get that pushback, I think it would be important for you to be able to express that your understanding is that, they're able to look at a lot of different resources, and that you're probably talking about an hour or two of time here and there, and that, help me understand why that would amount to an undue burden. Because I think sometimes when you ask them to lay it out and be specific, they're going to have a hard time justifying that conclusion. But I think people are, inherently a little worried about asking for the accommodation in the first place, and then if they're told, hey, this is too expensive, it's easy to just kind of walk away at that point. So I just wanted to make sure that you all know that you can push back on that, and I absolutely would. Tips and tricks, these are just some things to keep in mind. They mostly come from my experience with things going badly again. So, write things down, keep a log of interactions, mark the date and time. This isn't if things are going really well, but if you're having trouble securing an accommodation, it's important to be able to show all of the different attempts that you made to do the right thing, to talk with a supervisor, all of those, good faith efforts that were made on one side that you feel, maybe aren't being returned. Keep your own copy of company policies and procedures. I've had a lot of instances where someone will be told that a specific accommodation can't be provided because of a particular company policy, but then when you ask for that policy, it actually doesn't exist. So I always suggest, go see what the policies really say, have your own copy, don't just rely on the information that you're being given. I don't know if you are all already totally familiar with JAN, but I always like to point it out. It's the Job Accommodation Network. It's a great website where you can search by disability and also by accommodation type. And if you're kind of struggling for, hey, what might be a good accommodation to request in this particular circumstance, JAN will help you come up with some ideas. Last but not least, did you get your reasonable accommodation after you went through this process that we've discussed? My advice is always, don't get frustrated and walk out. First, talk to somebody about the situation. If denied, you can always call the DLC to discuss your options. And I highlighted the free part at the beginning because I think that sometimes prevents people from giving us a call. And also, I just want to point out that our services are always client-driven. So if a client comes to meet with us and after talking to us, they don't want to do anything other than have that meeting, that's totally fine. We don't, kind of run in there guns a-blazing, telling employers they're violating everybody's rights. We take the approach that best suits the client and the situation. So I think I just wanted to make that clear as well. If something goes bad and you do want to pursue it, there are ways and avenues to do that, and we would certainly be happy to kind of talk through those with you. You would talk to someone like me, or probably more likely Rose, or some other attorney that works at the DLC. But that's kind of the broad strokes of what I have for you today. Are there any questions?
Just that, it is hard for us to ask for accommodations a lot. And I know I will often go someplace and try all kinds of other things. Like I let myself fail the first time. And then when I go back, I insist on art at that point. Now, if I ever go back, if this is what I need, I'll try everything else, and it just didn't work. So this is what I need to participate, just like anybody else. So should I just be going right away for art instead of allowing myself to fail first?
I would. I think that is a very common tale, and I think that unfortunately the reason for that is that probably, maybe there have been bad experiences in the past, or maybe you haven't gotten what you need, or I think even more likely is there's sometimes this attitude that employers or whomever is kind of doing a favor by granting the accommodation, but legally that couldn't be more wrong. This is a law that is in place to make sure that people have equal access. And if you don't have what you need, you don't have equal access. And I think the only way you change that narrative is just to, I think earlier we said, what's the key here? And it was ask, ask, ask. I would absolutely second that. I think it's important to ask for what you need. And again, to be able to say, the reason I'm asking for card and not this or that are the following reasons, right? Nobody knows your disability and your situation better than you. And so to be able to articulate to an employer or a disability resource center or whomever what you have tried, why it didn't work, and why another option, again, the key isn't going to be effective, I think is important. And it's also your right. And I don't think you should ever be worried about essentially getting the same thing as everybody else. I know that's like a perfect world spiel for you, but I really do think that's right. And if it doesn't go well, you can give us a call.
Just to add to that, as we're all aware in this room, there's so much ignorance out there, not in a negative sense, just in a I don't understand someone's lack of hearing ability. I think it's really important for you to think of the ask in the sense that the more I ask for this reasonable accommodation, which is the most effective way for me to have a level playing field, the more I ask, the more I help educate employers, public, facilities, educational institutions. So I think it's so important, not just for you to have that accommodation, but it helps educate everyone else little by little. So the more you raise the issue, the more people learn about CART and these other options. I've heard so many times recently, even just in the last week, I've heard people tell me, I don't want to ask because I don't want to rock the boat. And my answer is always no. We need to rock the boat. We need to rock the boat because when the boat is rocking, that's when people start learning and understanding.
I second Rose as well. That was great.
I have a question about entertainment. So say that there's somebody coming to a comedy club or something. What can we do for that? Is there anything?
You mean if you would need captioning or an interpreter or something at a comedy club? So that would be covered under a different title of the ADA, but same process, same analysis. That's a private establishment. It would be covered under Title III of the ADA, and they're going to have to provide you with an accommodation that is effective. So sometimes is it a fight about what's effective? Yeah, it is. But again, that's why it's important to be able to articulate, this is why I can tell you that this is the accommodation that is effective and these accommodations aren't effective for the following reason. But you have every right in the world to go to a comedy show just like everybody else and laugh and understand. I think that's probably super essential at a comedy show more than almost anything else I can think of to have access to, real-time understanding of what's being said. So absolutely. Anything else? Oh. Yes.
Laura, do you want to address the issue of whether it would be helpful for anyone making this request for CART, for example, to go empowered with a general sense as to its cost so that that can factor into the request?
Yes, I tried to do some internet, some Googling, as you know how effective Googling is, about how much it costs. I don't know what your all experience is. I mean, what are kind of the ballpark figures that we're talking about from your experience?
So when people call me, I'm very candid. It can be anywhere from $60 an hour to $150 an hour. There's usually a 2-hour minimum. If somebody is quoting you much lower than $60 an hour, you're going to have a bad experience. That's something just personally I've seen happen in the 17 years I've worked with people. We're very close-lipped on our prices, I'll be really honest, because there's a lot of worry about undercutting. I really don't worry about that. If you don't like my price, I'm happy to give you a whole range of people to call. About 10 years ago, was it that long? 10 years ago, Westminster called and asked my rates, and I gave it to them, and they said, thank you very much. And I said, would you like a couple other contacts? And they said yes, and I gave them a list and sent them to the Sanderson Center website. After that semester, I got a phone call back, when can you start? They had hired somebody who wasn't really a professional, but gave a really good price, and the student was about to fail out of school. So, doesn't happen often, but the only state with legislation for CART is Nevada. So to understand CART and how it works and the speeds, I will go through that with an employer. They should be able to show you a certification that they can type 200 words per minute or more from a certified accredited school. If they're new out of school, what they can cover versus what they can cover after many years is going to be different because we build our dictionaries. So, for example, one of my first jobs was a conference, and it was like doTERRA. Do you guys know what doTERRA is? Where it's the chemical, I don't know what they're called. So oils, essential oils and essential vitamins and all of that. I had no idea what this guy talking 250 words a minute to an audience of 300 was even talking about. no script beforehand, nothing. I didn't know what I had signed up for, and by then, at hour 2, I said, I'm in over my head. Somebody professional needs to come in who's got experience in this type of thing. So people need to know. I'll go back to my pharmacy student. The first semester in the chemistry, metabolic chemistry, foreign professor. Again, 30 years of his job. I have no idea what he was talking about. There's multiple chemicals that actually, the only difference is a capital A and a lowercase a in between the compounds. And he also did ASL, and I sent him an email and I says, I don't know that I'm even helping you in this class. I don't know if there's anybody in our industry locally who's ever done pharmacy. Do you need to bring in an interpreter? And the response was, oh no, I have to poke my eyes out. Because the guy spoke so fast. He says, no, just don't worry about it. And in tears one day after class, one of the other students came up to me and says, don't worry about it. None of us know what he's talking about. We just read the text. So I literally was giving him the accommodation he needed. The other students wished they had it, even though it wasn't perfect. It's that kind of, so $60 to $150 an hour, 2-hour minimum is usually about what you're going to see. The Typewell.com website talks about if you've got a need that's going to hire, you want to hire somebody, they can help train somebody, and you can put somebody on staff. That's going to cost you a lot less. But that's somebody you're going to be using all day, every day, for whatever reason. I think it kind of falls the same way with interpreters. Sometimes having somebody on staff is cheaper.
I mean, I don't think those numbers are really all that high, frankly. So, so we're talking about what, at the high end, $150 for 2 hours, so $300, for 2 hours, maybe $450 for 3. I guess we can do the math on what a full day would be. But so we're talking about the total resources that would be available to a company, and we're talking about a few $100s. That's the calculation that we should be making, right? I mean, for most companies, that's going to be an expense that's just the cost of doing business. I can understand that they don't want to, but that's not the analysis under the law. The analysis under the law is what are your resources, who's available to do it, what's going to provide equal access. So I think that it never hurts to have that information on hand and to be able to convey it to your employer. If they're able to talk to someone like Julia and have her walk them through why that's important and reasonable, all the better. But again, I think unfortunately most of the time you're going to be in the position of providing that education.
This is kind of off the card, but I had an experience. My mom's in a nursing home in Murray, and I had a sister who's deaf. That was in Alaska, and she came down to visit Mom, and we had a meeting with the social services, and she wanted an interpreter. And being that I know sign, I could interpret for her, but she said, no, that's not your responsibility. I want a certified interpreter, because you're part of the meeting. And so when I requested it with the nursing home, they said that we cannot provide that unless your mother is deaf. Then we would provide that interpreter. Does the law, is that right?
So a nursing home would probably be a Title III entity because they're essentially an entity that's open to the public. There's kind of 3 tiers. There's employment, there's state and local governments, and then there's kind of private entities. So a nursing facility would likely fall under that. And I don't practice all of the time in Title III. As you can tell, I'm more well-versed in Title I. But I think the analysis would be kind of like what is the service they provide, because they would have to make that accessible. So maybe it's a fight, and I can see why the nursing home would say that. But I guess the counter argument would be, but if you facilitate communication for everybody else's family, you know, you would have to do the same for this individual. So, you know, I haven't had a case like that recently, and the analysis might be a little different. I think the question would kind of hinge on who are those services that the nursing facility provides for. They're going to interpret that in the most narrow way possible, right? It's only for the people who reside in my nursing facility. But there's probably an argument that it goes beyond that and that they do provide those services in other contexts. So I can't give you kind of a yes or no, right or wrong, but that's kind of how I would think about it. I don't know, Rose, do you have any other thoughts on that?
My only other thought would be if the nursing home were looking at the purpose for the meeting. So for example, if it was the nursing home social worker who was facilitating the meeting with the family for a specific purpose related to the care of your mother, then to me, it seems like that would be an argument to say, well, wait a minute, this is a meeting, directly related to the well-being and care of our mother, and the social worker is involved in facilitating it, so therefore this really is for my mother. So I would, think of it in those terms, but again, going along with what Laura said, I can see how they would narrowly say, no, this is only for our residents, the patients who live here who have a hearing impairment. But I think there's an argument to be made depending on the context of the meeting. So again, we focus mostly on Title I, but I do think that there might be an argument to be made there.
Anything else? Okay, well, just so you guys know, we do have some fact sheets. We have some cards wherein you can contact the Disability Law Center and our intake team. We have some copies of the presentation if anyone wants it. And we have some fact sheets about how to request reasonable accommodation. So we'll leave those up here if you guys want to take a look. Thank you.
Okay, so we are right at 8 o'clock, so I will call it a really wonderful presentation. Thank you to Julia and Charity and Laura and Rose. We appreciated you being here. We did record it so people could come back to it and watch it. Seems like the weather has been keeping people home lately. So, but thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. Thank you. And have a good night, everybody. Yeah.